November 11, 1918. 10:59 a.m.
Exactly 1 minute before the armistice takes effect. Somewhere near the Meuse River, northeastern France, American soldier Henry Gunther rises from the trench.
Against his sergeant's direct orders. Against all reason.
He charges alone toward a German machine gun position.
The Germans on the other side already know the war will end in seconds. They desperately try to wave him down. They shout in English, "Stop! War over!" But Gunther keeps running.
At 10:59, a short burst of machine gun fire.
Gunther falls dead. 1 minute later, at exactly 11 a.m., silence. After 4 years, 3 months, and 10 days of incessant bombardment, the guns finally stop. 700 kilometers of front, from the North Sea to Switzerland. Total silence. Some soldiers cautiously emerge from the trenches. They look at the enemy across no man's land. Some wave.
Others just stare, stunned. One British soldier would later write, "The silence was as deafening as the bombardment.
I thought I'd gone deaf.
Then I heard a bird singing.
I started to cry." This is the most important moment of the 20th century that you probably never studied in depth.
Over the next 20 minutes, you'll discover the complete story of the Armistice of Compiègne. The story of how the bloodiest war humanity had ever seen finally ended.
But it didn't end on a battlefield.
It ended in a train wagon. In a forest clearing. In negotiations that lasted only 72 hours but changed the course of history. You'll meet Matthias Erzberger, the ordinary man forced to carry the impossible weight of signing his nation's defeat. A man who knew it would destroy him.
And it did, assassinated 3 years later.
You'll meet Ferdinand Foch, the French marshal who dictated terms so harsh he prophesied, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years.
He was right.
20 years and 64 days later, World War II began. You'll hear about Henry Gunther and other soldiers who died unnecessarily in the final hours, minutes, even seconds before the ceasefire. And you'll understand how this armistice, signed to end the war to end all wars, actually planted the seeds for an even more devastating conflict.
This is the story of November 11, 1918.
The day the world changed. And the day the world made mistakes we would pay for with 50 million lives just 2 decades later. To understand what happened in November 1918, you need to understand how broken Europe was. In 4 years and 3 months, World War I had done something no one thought possible. It completely destroyed the world order that had existed for centuries.
9 million soldiers dead. 21 million wounded.
7 million civilians dead from starvation, disease, and violence.
Entire economies in ruins. Agricultural fields devastated. Cities transformed into rubble.
But more than that, for empires, some centuries old, were collapsing simultaneously.
Bulgaria was the first to fall. On September 29, 1918, it signed an armistice after the Allies' Vardar offensive.
The Ottoman Empire, which had once dominated from Morocco to Persia, was exhausted.
Defeated in Palestine, Mesopotamia, on all fronts.
On October 30th, it capitulated with the Armistice of Mudros.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the great multi-ethnic power of Central Europe, disintegrated internally.
Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, all proclaiming independence.
On November 3, it signed an armistice at Villa Giusti.
Days later, it would cease to exist.
And there remained Germany.
But the Germany of November 1918 was no longer the confident empire that had started the war with the Schlieffen Plan in August 1914. Militarily, the German army was exhausted. The Great Spring Offensives of 1918, 5 massive attacks between March and July, had failed. They got within 64 kilometers of Paris.
But couldn't break through.
And exhausted their last reserves. Meanwhile, Americans were arriving in France at a rate of 10,000 soldiers per day.
Fresh. Well-equipped. Motivated. On August 8, the Battle of Amiens. General Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army.
German lines began to crumble.
Economically, Germany was broken.
The British naval blockade, in effect since 1914, was starving civilians. Between 1914 and 1918, an estimated 424,000 German civilians died from malnutrition and related diseases.
And politically, revolution was coming. On October 29, 1918, sailors of the High Seas Fleet in Kiel discovered that admirals were planning one final suicidal honorable battle against the British Royal Navy.
The sailors refused.
"We've been cannon fodder for 4 years," one of them, Karl Artelt, shouted. "We won't die in a glory mission while politicians negotiate peace."
The revolt spread like fire. Within days, 40,000 sailors, soldiers, and workers controlled Kiel. Revolutionary councils were established, echoing the Russian Revolution of 1917. From Kiel, the revolution went to Hamburg,
Munich, Frankfurt, and finally, Berlin.
The German Empire, which had existed for only 47 years but dominated Europe, was crumbling from within.
And it was in this context, empire falling, army defeated, revolution in the streets, that Germany sent a delegation to negotiate the armistice. But as you'll see, it wouldn't be negotiation. It would be humiliation. On September 29, 1918, at German headquarters in Spa, Belgium, a meeting took place that would change everything. General Erich Ludendorff and Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, the two men who had effectively ruled Germany militarily since 1916, summoned Kaiser Wilhelm II. Ludendorff, known for his unshakable confidence, was visibly shaken. "We need an armistice immediately," he declared. "The military situation is untenable. We could collapse at any moment." This admission shocked German political leadership. Until that week, Ludendorff had assured them that victory, or at least a favorable draw, was still possible. The reality, the Hindenburg Line, Germany's last major defensive position, had been breached. The army was exhausted. And hundreds of thousands of Americans were arriving every month. On October 4, the new German government, led by Prince Max von Baden, sent a note to American President Woodrow Wilson requesting an armistice. Why Wilson? Because in January 1918, Wilson had announced his 14-point principles for a just peace, without punitive annexations, with national self-determination. The Germans hoped Wilson would be more generous than the vengeful French and British. They were dramatically wrong. While diplomats negotiated, Germany was falling apart. The sailors' revolt in Kiel spread. On November 9, 500,000 workers went on strike in Berlin. Soldiers joined the protesters. Chancellor Prince Max von Baden made an extraordinary decision. At noon on November 9, he announced Kaiser Wilhelm II's abdication. Without even consulting the Kaiser first. Wilhelm, taking refuge at headquarters in Spa, resisted furiously. Abdicate? Never. I am Kaiser by the will of God. But his own generals abandoned him. Hindenburg, with tears in his eyes, said, "Majesty, the army will no longer fight for you. You must leave for exile." At 2 p.m., Wilhelm boarded a special train to neutral Holland. He would never set foot on German soil again. He would die in exile in 1941. At 2 p.m. on November 9, Philip Scheidmann, Social Democratic leader, stood at a Reichstag window and proclaimed, "The old and rotten system has fallen. Long live the German Republic." Hours later, Karl Liebknecht, communist leader, proclaimed a free socialist republic from the Berlin Palace. Germany was on the brink of civil war. Friedrich Ebert assumed office as chancellor of the new republic. His number one priority, stop the external war to deal with the internal revolution. Someone had to go to France to negotiate the armistice. But no general wanted to carry that historical stain. So they chose a civilian. A 43-year-old politician from the Center Party. An ordinary man. Matthias Erzberger. Before we continue with Erzberger's journey, pause for a second. If you're finding this documentary fascinating, if you're learning details about World War I you never knew before, hit that like button now. It helps the YouTube algorithm tremendously to recommend this video to other people interested in in-depth history. And if you want to follow the entire series of complete documentaries about the battles and events of World War I, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Because detailed historical content like this 50, 60-minute videos diving deep into the facts is rare on YouTube. And the more support you give, the more documentaries like this we can produce. Now, let's return to November 1918. And to Matthias Erzberger, the man about to carry an impossible burden. Matthias Erzberger was no general. No aristocrat. He was the son of a tailor and postman. Born in 1875 in Buttenhausen, southern Germany. He studied in Catholic seminaries, planning to become a priest. Changed course and became a teacher. Then, a journalist. In 1903, at age 28, he was elected to the Reichstag for the Catholic Center Party. He was a talented orator and writer. When the war began in 1914, Erzberger enthusiastically supported it. Like most Germans, he believed in his nation's just cause. But as the carnage dragged on, he became one of the first German politicians to advocate for negotiated peace. In July 1917, he authored the famous peace resolution of the Reichstag, calling for peace without annexations. A courageous position that earned him fierce hatred from nationalists and militarists. Now, in November 1918, he was chosen to lead the armistice delegation. Why him? First, he was civilian, not military. Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg wanted a civilian to sign the defeat, so as not to tarnish the honor of the army. Second, he was already associated with peace negotiation. Blaming him would be easy. Third, he was from the Center Party, supporting the new Republican government. Erzberger accepted the mission knowing it would destroy him. 3 weeks before leaving for Compiègne, he had visited his dying son. Enormous emotional trauma. Now he carried a greater historical trauma, admitting Germany's defeat. He was a devout Catholic. He knew many would see him as a traitor. But he believed it was his duty to stop the killing. If this makes me a traitor in some people's eyes, he would later write, so be it. I'd rather bear this cross than let one more German soldier die in an already lost war. Tragic prophecy. On August 26, 1921, 3 years later, right-wing extremists would assassinate him on a forest trail. He died at 45, punished for signing an armistice that saved lives but wounded national pride. But we're getting ahead of the story. On November 6, 1918, Erzberger was still alive. And he was about to embark on the most terrible journey of his life. November 6, 1918. Cold morning in Berlin. 4 men gathered discreetly for the most humiliating mission imaginable. Matthias Erzberger, leader. Count von Oberndorf, diplomat. Major General von Winterfeldt, Army representative. Captain Vanslow, Navy representative. Before departing, Erzberger received final instructions: obtain the best possible terms. But accept anything to stop the killing. In other words, you have no bargaining power. Accept whatever they demand. On November 7, the delegation crossed the front lines near La Capelle. 5 automobiles. White flags. French troops awaited them. And what followed was calculatedly cruel. The journey should have taken 3 or 4 hours. The French made it last 10 hours. Through northern France devastated by war. Deliberately, the French chose the longest route. Through the worst battlefields. Completely destroyed villages. Not a wall standing. Only rubble and craters. Fields riddled by millions of artillery shells. Earth turned inside out. Mud mixed with twisted metal and bones. Ghostly forests. Dead trees, without leaves, without branches. Only black and carbonized trunks pointing to the sky like accusing fingers. The Germans traveled in silence. Erzberger would later describe, it was more traumatic than the journey to my son's deathbed. Von Winterfeldt, the general, looked through the window and saw what his army had done. The destruction. The suffering. The French didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The ruins spoke for them. See what you did to our country. The journey lasted all night. Without sleep. Cold. Exhausted. Finally, at dawn on November 8, they reached the Compiègne forest. Dense fog. Autumn leaves covering the ground. Cutting cold. 2 trains awaited in an isolated clearing. 2 parallel railway lines, separated by 100 meters. On one train, Ferdinand Foch and the Allied delegation. On the other, accommodation for the Germans. Erzberger got out of the car. Legs stiff after 10 hours sitting. Back aching. Eyes red from fatigue. He looked at the wagon where Foch awaited him. He knew what was coming. Humiliation. Impossible terms. The weight of 70 million Germans on his shoulders. He took a deep breath. Prayed briefly. And walked toward wagon 2419D. The wagon where history would change. November 8, 1918. 9 a.m. The Germans were led to wagon 2419D. This wagon deserves description. Before the war, it was a luxury dining car. It served sophisticated meals to wealthy passengers in Deauville, elegant coastal city. Now, requisitioned as Foch's mobile office. Modified interior, mahogany table in center. Military maps on walls. Small stove against the cold. Ferdinand Foch awaited them, seated at the table. 67 years old, short, imposing mustache, penetrating eyes that could intimidate any subordinate. Beside him, General Maxime Weygand, his inseparable chief of staff. And Admiral Rosalind Weems, British representative. The atmosphere was glacial. Not just from November's temperature. But from deliberate hostility. Erzberger, expecting basic diplomatic courtesy, extended his hand to greet Foch. Foch looked at the extended hand. Then at Erzberger's face. And didn't move. Didn't offer his hand. Didn't stand. Didn't say good morning. He simply asked, coldly, in French, "What brings you gentlemen here? What do you wish?" 3 seconds. A moment that established everything to come. This wouldn't be negotiation between equals. It would be dictation of terms to defeated power. Erzberger, disconcerted, withdrew his hand. "We have come to receive the Allies' proposals for an armistice." "There are no proposals," Foch replied icily. "You are requesting an armistice. You must tell me what you want." No accidental wordplay. Foch wanted to establish from the start, you are supplicants, not diplomats. The Germans, travel clothes wrinkled after 10 hours of journey, without sleep, sat down. Before them, Allied officers impeccably uniformed. The message was clear, you don't deserve respect. Finally, Erzberger said, "We respectfully request to know the armistice conditions." Foch nodded to Weygand. And Weygand began to read. For 90 minutes, Weygand methodically read the 34 articles of the armistice. His voice cold and precise. Reading devastating terms without any emotion. The Germans listened in growing silence and horror. The conditions were far worse than Wilson's 14 points they had expected. Evacuation of all occupied territories in just 15 days. France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine. Withdrawal from the entire left bank of the Rhine in 31 days. And the military material surrender was crushing: 5,000 cannons, 25,000 machine guns, 3,000 mortars, 1,700 aircraft, 5,000 locomotives, 150,000 railway wagons, surrender of all submarines. Internment of the high seas fleet, the warships that were Germany's pride. Continuation of the British naval blockade. In other words, German civilians would continue starving. repatriation of all Allied prisoners immediately. But German prisoners would remain detained.
And reparation for damages caused amount to be determined later. When the gun finished, heavy silence filled the wagon.
Erzberger was pale.
The conditions weren't an armistice.
They were total surrender. Von Winterfeldt, the German general, finally spoke. Voice trembling with contained emotion, Einvok von 70 Millionen leidet, aber es stirbt nicht.
A nation of 70 million suffers, but it does not die. It was a declaration of defiance.
An affirmation that even defeated, Germany would survive. Foch didn't even respond. Just nodded coldly. As if to say, we'll see.
It's 11 o'clock now, Foch said. You have until Monday, November 11th, at 11 a.m.
72 hours. 3 days. After that, the deadline expires and the terms will be even more severe.
The Germans were led back to their train. Erzberger immediately sent an urgent message to Berlin via radio, detailing the conditions. But the response would be slow.
Communications were chaotic. Revolution was sweeping Germany. The government barely controlled Berlin, much less the entire country.
Meanwhile, on the Western Front, fighting continued. Soldiers were still dying.
With each hour of waiting, more casualties. And in Berlin, that Sunday, November 9th, Germany was transformed. Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate.
He fled to Holland. The Republic was proclaimed. Friedrich Ebert assumed office as Chancellor. The empire that had existed for 47 years ceased to exist in a matter of hours. And in the Raton clearing, Erzberger waited anxiously. He knew each hour of delay meant more dead in the trenches. In the trenches, soldiers on both sides knew an armistice was being negotiated.
But orders were to continue fighting. Allied commanders, especially Americans, wanted to gain as much ground as possible before the armistice. They ordered attacks until the last minute. Sunday, November 10th. Erzberger didn't sleep.
He spent the early morning meticulously studying each of the 34 articles.
Making notes. Calculating implications.
At 2 a.m., he summoned his colleagues.
We have few hours, he said. We must try to obtain at least some concessions. But everyone knew the truth, they had no bargaining power whatsoever.
Erzberger walked nervously through the forest.
Autumn leaves under his feet. Cold fog. Absolute silence. He was a religious man, devout Catholic. He prayed, asking for divine guidance. He thought of his son, who had died 3 weeks before. He thought of his wife. His other children. He thought of the millions of Germans who would blame him for what he was about to do. He knew with prophetic certainty that he would be destroyed for it. But he believed it was his moral duty to stop the killing. Finally, at 10 p.m. Sunday, the message from Berlin arrived. Ebert and the new government authorized Erzberger to sign under whatever conditions can be obtained. In other words, sign anything. Germany had no choice left. November 11, 1918. Erzberger didn't sleep.
He spent the night in vigil. At 5 a.m., still dark, the 4 German delegates walked again through the forest to Foch's wagon. Autumn had transformed the clearing into a melancholic landscape.
Fallen leaves. Dense fog. Cutting cold. Inside wagon 2419D, oil lamps cast flickering shadows. Foch awaited them. Impassive as always.
Erzberger made a last attempt to negotiate slightly less punitive terms.
He asked that the naval blockade be suspended to allow food imports.
The German population was dying of starvation.
Foch coldly refused.
He asked for reduction in the quantity of military material to be surrendered.
Refused. He asked that German prisoners be released simultaneously with the Allies. Refused. Finally, Erzberger, defeated, said, "We sign." His voice trembled. At 5:20 a.m., Matthias Erzberger took the fountain pen offered to him.
His hand trembled visibly. Beside him, the other 3 German delegates also signed.
On the other side of the table, Ferdinand Foch and Rosalind Weems signed for the Allies. There were no handshakes. No words of courtesy. No celebration. The silence in the wagon was oppressive. Foch looked coldly at Erzberger and said only, "It is done. The armistice will take effect at 11 a.m. The Germans rose. They bowed stiffly. Foch didn't return the courtesy. They left the wagon. Outside, in the cold morning fog, Erzberger stopped. He looked at the sky beginning to brighten. And whispered, more to himself than to others, "Gott verze, was we're getting haben." May God forgive what we have done. It wasn't clear if he was referring to signing the armistice. Or to the 4 years of war that preceded it. Probably both. We're reaching the crucial moment of this story. The armistice was signed. But 5.5 hours remained before it took effect. And as you'll discover now, those 5 hours were some of the most unnecessarily deadly of the entire war. But first, if you're enjoying this level of historical detail, share this video with someone who also loves in-depth history. And leave in the comments, did you know these details about the armistice? Did you know about Matthias Erzberger and his tragic fate? Now let's go to the final hours of World War I. And to the question historians debate to this day, why wait 5.5 hours? Why not stop immediately? 5:20 a.m. Armistice signed. 11 a.m.
Armistice would take effect.
5.5 hours interval.
The decision to wait until the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month was purely symbolic.
Foch wanted the perfect symbolism.
But it had horrible consequences. In the trenches, commanders on both sides knew an armistice had been signed. The war would end in hours.
But the orders were, continue fighting.
Some Allied commanders, particularly inexperienced Americans, ordered attacks until the last minute. They wanted to gain ground before the ceasefire. They wanted final glory. General John J. Pershing, American commander, was harshly criticized for not declaring a unilateral ceasefire as soon as the armistice was signed. In these 5.5 hours, approximately 2,750 soldiers were killed. Approximately 8,250 were wounded. Total, about 11,000 casualties. Completely unnecessary. The armistice was signed. The war had technically ended. But men continued dying. I'll tell 3 stories. 3 among thousands. Henry Nicholas John Gunther. 23 years old. Baltimore, Maryland, United States. 6 months earlier, he had been demoted from sergeant to private. His crime, writing a letter to a friend discouraging him from enlisting. The letter was intercepted by military censors.
Gunther was punished for discouraging recruitment.
For months, he desperately sought to redeem his honor.
Morning of November 11th.
At 10 a.m., his unit received news, armistice would begin at 11 a.m.
At 10:30 a.m., an officer ordered, stop advancing.
It made no sense to die with half an hour left. But at 10:58 a.m., Gunther saw a German machine gun position 100 meters ahead. Against direct orders from his sergeant Ernest Powell, who shouted, "Gunther, get back here.
Are you crazy?" 1 minute left. Gunther stood up. He grabbed his Browning automatic rifle
and charged alone against the German position. The German soldiers on the other side already knew the armistice would begin in seconds. They frantically tried to wave Gunther down.
They shouted in English, "Stop! Stop! War over!" Gunther kept running. With less than 30 seconds until the armistice, reluctantly, they opened fire. Short burst of machine gun fire. Gunther fell dead. Exactly at 10:59 a.m.
1 minute later, at 11 a.m., the ceasefire took effect. The Germans who killed him emerged from their trench. They looked sadly at the body.
One of them placed a German helmet over Gunther's face. As a sign of respect. Henry Gunther is officially the last soldier killed in World War I.
2 minutes before Gunther, at 10:58 a.m., George Lawrence Price, Canadian soldier, killed by German sniper in Mons, Belgium. Ironically, the same city where the British fought their first battle in August 1914. Price was 25 years old. He left behind a pregnant wife in Canada. 5 minutes before the armistice, at 10:55 a.m., Augustin Trebuchet, French soldier of the 415th Infantry Regiment. He was running between trenches carrying a message for his unit. The message, hot soup will be served at 11:30 a.m. after the ceasefire. German artillery fire hit him. His body was found still holding the message about soup. Banal and tragic detail that summarized the absurdity of dying minutes before peace. Battery 4 of the American 14-inch naval railway guns fired its last shot at 10:57 and 30 seconds. 2 minutes and 30 seconds before the armistice. The shell was timed to land well behind German lines exactly at 11 a.m. Commanders wanted the pride of firing literally the last shot of the war. Among the artillery commanders who fired under orders until 10:45 a.m. was Captain Harry S. Truman. Yes, the future President of the United States. He would later write in his diary, "The silence was as deafening as the bombardment. No one celebrated. We were just stunned that it was over." A U.S. congressional inquiry in 1919 investigated these unnecessary deaths. It severely criticized commanders who ordered attacks after learning of the armistice. But nothing would change the fact, 11,000 casualties that didn't need to happen. November 11, 1918. 11 a.m. Exactly. Along the entire Western Front. 700 kilometers in length. From the North Sea to the Swiss border. Fire ceased. The artillery bombardment that had sounded incessantly for 4 years, 3 months, and 10 days, stopped. The silence was so abrupt and complete it was physically shocking. Soldiers accustomed to constant noise, explosions, machine gun fire, screams, roaring aircraft suddenly heard nothing. Birds. Wind in devastated trees. Their own breathing. One British soldier, Lieutenant Edward Chapman, wrote, "The silence was as deafening as the bombardment. My ears were ringing. I thought for a moment I'd gone deaf. Then I heard a little bird singing, a sound I hadn't heard in 4 years. I started to cry." Slowly, cautiously, soldiers began to emerge from the trenches. They climbed the rotting wooden ladders. They emerged into no man's land. On the other side, enemies from minutes before did the same.
They looked at each other. Meters apart. Some waved.
Others simply stared, stunned, barely able to process that it was over.
A German took out a cigarette. Offered it to an Englishman. The Englishman accepted. They didn't speak the same language.
But they shared fire. At Verdun, where 700,000 men had died in 1916, French bugler Octave Delaluc played the 13 official notes of the ceasefire.
At exactly 11 a.m.
Tears ran down his face as he played. In the trenches, there was no immediate celebration.
Only exhaustion. Disbelief. Deep mourning.
One British soldier wrote in a letter, "We expected to feel joy, but only felt emptiness." Many of us cried, not from happiness but from loss, thinking of all the comrades who didn't live to see this moment. But in Paris, London, New York, the world exploded in celebration. In Paris, air raid sirens sounded at 11 a.m. But this time to announce peace, not bombardments.
Gas lamps were lit for the first time in 4 years. In London, Big Ben, silenced since 1914, chimed again.
Massive crowds at Buckingham Palace, calling for the royal family. In New York, despite it being only 6 a.m., factory sirens sounded. Workers poured into the streets.
But beneath the celebration, mourning. In almost every French family, someone had died. In almost every British family, someone had died. Celebration and sadness, inextricably intertwined.
In Berlin, the reaction was more somber. There was relief that the killing had ended.
But also shock. Confusion. Anger. Many Germans simply couldn't believe they had lost. German troops still occupied enemy territory. No Allied soldier had set foot on German soil. How could they have lost? One German soldier wrote in his diary, "They tell us the war is over. But we're on French territory. We haven't been defeated. How can the war be over?" What sense did any of this make? This incomprehension. This denial.
Would plant the seed of the poisonous legend of the stab in the back. The idea that the German army had never been defeated militarily.
But betrayed by civilian politicians, socialists, Jews at home. Complete lie. But powerful lie.
Adolf Hitler, war veteran, blinded by mustard gas in a military hospital when he heard news of the armistice, brilliantly exploited this legend. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, Ferdinand Foch famously declared, "Ce n'est pas un paix.
C'est un armistice de 20 ans. This is not peace.
It is an armistice for 20 years.
Terrifyingly accurate prophecy. 20 years and 64 days later, on September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland.
World War II began. And in June 1940, after defeating France in 6 weeks, Hitler orchestrated perfect symbolic revenge. He ordered that the Franco-German armistice be signed in exactly the same wagon 2419D. In the same Ratonde clearing.
In the same Compiègne forest. The wagon was dragged out of the museum where it was on display.
Positioned exactly in the same spot as 1918. Hitler sat exactly in the chair where Foch had sat 22 years before. French generals sat where Germans had sat in 1918. Hitler left the negotiations after reading the preamble.
Deliberately replicating Foch's cold behavior. The humiliation was complete. Afterward, Hitler ordered the wagon taken to Berlin as a war trophy.
In 1945, when Germany was losing the war, the SS destroyed the wagon to prevent Allied recapture.
The wagon displayed in the Compiègne Museum today is a replica, donated in 1950.
But the original, the wagon that witnessed both the 1918 armistice and the 1940 revenge, was burned. Like so much of Europe would be burned in World War II. The war Foch had foreseen. The war the 1918 armistice helped create.
November 11th became a remembrance holiday in many nations. In the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, Remembrance Day. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, the nation observes 2 minutes of silence. People wear red poppies, inspired by the poem In Flanders Fields. In the United States, Veterans Day, honoring all military veterans. In France, Jour de l'Armistice, national holiday. The president lays a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier under the Arc de Triomphe. Tombs of unknown soldiers in various nations, Westminster Abbey, Arc de Triomphe, Arlington, were all established in the years after the armistice. To honor millions whose bodies were never identified. Or never found. The Armistice Museum in Compiègne today attracts 50,000 visitors annually. The clearing, once the stage of humiliation and revenge, is now a place of reflection. About the terrible cost of war. And about the most important lesson the 1918 armistice teaches us: punitive peace creates resentment. And resentment creates the next war. The armistice and Treaty of Versailles were harsh enough to humiliate and enrage Germany. But not harsh enough to permanently prevent it from rearming. Worst possible combination. As historian Margaret Macmillan wrote, the Treaty of Versailles was neither Carthaginian peace nor just peace. It was worse, a middle ground that guaranteed resentment without guaranteeing security. The lesson had to be relearned at terrible cost. After World War II, the Allies took a dramatically different approach. The Marshall Plan rebuilt European economies, including former enemies. Germany and Japan were helped, not destroyed.
This approach, building peace through reconstruction and reconciliation, not punishment, worked. Western Europe and Japan became prosperous democracies and allies. But the lesson required 50 million dead in World War II to be learned.
16 million in World War I, 50 million in World War II. 66 million lives.
To learn that peace must be built on justice and reconciliation,
not on humiliation and revenge.
Matthias Erzberger, the man who bore the weight of the armistice, lived only 3 more years. From June 1919 to March 1920, he served as vice-chancellor and finance minister of the new Weimar Republic. He implemented radical fiscal reforms to stabilize Germany's devastated economy. But this only increased the hatred right-wing extremists felt for him. For the nationalist right, he was a double traitor. He had signed the armistice and stolen the people's money with taxes.
August 26, 1921. Erzberger was walking with his friend Karl Diaz on a forest trail near Bad Griesbach, Black Forest. 2 young right-wing extremists, Heinrich Tellesen and Heinrich Schultz, approached them. They opened fire. Erzberger tried to run. 3 shots hit his lung, stomach, and leg. He died at 45 years old. Assassinated for signing an armistice that saved countless German lives. Former Kaiser Wilhelm II, exiled in Holland, celebrated the news with champagne. Many on the German right rejoiced. Erzberger became a martyr to Democrats,
but a scapegoat to nationalists.
His story is personal tragedy,
but also historical lesson.
About the cost of doing what's right. About the injustice that decent men sometimes face. And about how poisonous myths like the stab-in-the-back legend destroy those who try to prevent greater destruction. November 11, 1918. 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The moment silence fell over Europe after 4 years of incessant bombardment.
The moment 9 million dead soldiers were finally honored with a ceasefire. But also the moment that, paradoxically, planted seeds for 50 million more dead just 21 years later. This is the story of the Armistice of Compiègne. The story of how the bloodiest war humanity had ever seen ended not on a battlefield but in a train wagon.
Story of humiliation and revenge.
Of ordinary men carrying impossible burdens.
Of soldiers dying unnecessarily until the last second.
And the story of how poorly made peace can be as dangerous as war.
And you? What did you think of this story? Did you know these details about the armistice? Did you know about Matthias Erzberger and his tragic fate? Did you know about Henry Gunther, killed 1 minute before the ceasefire? Leave your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this in-depth 55-minute documentary, leave your like. And subscribe to the channel for more complete documentaries about World War I and World War II.
In the next video, we'll explore the Battle of Verdun, 303 days of hell that became a symbol of French determination.
700,000 dead. More shells fired in 10 hours than in the entire Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The phrase that defined the battle, ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass. Until then, thank you for watching. And remember, studying history isn't just about learning the past. It's about understanding the present.
And trying